Hi, it's Dougie Wood, and in this video I'm going to be talking to you all things SharePoint interview questions and answers. So before I go too far into the agenda for this particular video, I just wanted to kind of talk to you in terms of why I feel qualified to be talking about this. So I've had a long experience, past 15 years working with SharePoint across a lot of different roles, including a support analyst, developer, consultant, leading SharePoint teams, being a project manager, business analyst. I've had a lot of different aspects of my role using SharePoint. So I've been interviewed for many different jobs related to SharePoint, and also more my experience is actually interviewing others to join my team, building out development teams, consultancy teams, things like that, specifically for SharePoint. So this video is actually aimed at two kind of audiences in one video. You've got the actual interviewee, so if you're looking to get a job or land a job in SharePoint, these are the types of questions that you need to be prepared and ready to answer. But also you might be an interviewer, so it might be you're working in a HR department, recruitment, and you're looking to get some initial questions to ask people to figure out whether or not they are worth their salt, essentially, when it comes to the knowledge of SharePoint. So this video is going to be split out into a couple of different sections. So the first bit, in terms of introductions, so what you should cover and that sort of thing. General kind of housekeepings of interviews, about you, so a bit of about you and your working experience, as well as technical knowledge, some questions about SharePoint as we go through, and then general closeout, so great ways to close out interviews. Again, this is all from my personal experience, so it's worth kind of finding out from you as well what your thoughts and comments are. So use the comments feed below to let me know your experiences of SharePoint interviews. So the first thing is typical standard question when you first get into an interview and you've done the kind of polite introductions. The interviewer will often ask you, tell me about yourself. And this is where you want to be talking about the years of experience that you have with SharePoint, and be specific, sort of name, say I've worked with it for 5 years or 7 years or however long it is. But you want to summarize the last 12 months, because that's the most important thing realistically, because technology moves on so quickly. You want to be talking about what you've actually been up to using SharePoint in the last 12 months. Don't lie or overcommit. There's nothing worse, and actually quite often as a seasoned interviewer you'll pick up on when people are sort of lying to you about their knowledge of SharePoint, and you'll quickly get weeded out of the recruitment process. And also you don't want to overcommit, because even if you do blag your way through the interview and you do land the job, you don't want to find on your first day that you're out of your depth and you can't actually work at the same sort of rate or pace with the other team members. It's worth talking about yourself, your professional goals. So what exams maybe you're studying for related to SharePoint or Microsoft 365, what you're looking to sort of learn over the next kind of coming year, as well as maybe if you wanted to sort of grow into being a leader of a team or growing your own team, whatever your kind of professional goals are, it's worth talking about that. And be specific about why you are interested in this role. So actually, is it the company you want to work for? Do you think it's going to be exciting projects? Are you going to learn some new things? Have you got some skills you're going to bring to the table? So be specific about why you're interested in this particular role, rather than just why you're looking for a new job in general. But the key things about this is, as I say, summarize your last 12 months, what you've learned, and what kind of skills you've basically acquired in that last 12 months. So the next question is, what experience do you have working with SharePoint? So as I was saying before, I feel like I've covered a lot of broad area of working with SharePoint, but some people dedicate years, decades to actually just working in specific areas of SharePoint. So whether that's a support function, or you've been a SharePoint admin, so maybe you work for a very enterprise level organization where you've been the site collection admin of a SharePoint site and you just looked after that. Maybe you've been a project manager or an analyst, so you've been working alongside a development team to help sort of deliver projects, whether it be you're planning them or you're actually involved with being an analyst or a consultant to gather the requirements, creating technical documentation and things like that, or translating requirements from kind of human sort of language into kind of techie kind of language so that the development team will understand that. So all of that is really useful to know. Maybe you've been an intranet manager, so you've been responsible for creating content previously. Maybe you're a marketing kind of specialist that's moving into an intranet kind of role. Maybe you've created content and things like that for other systems, websites, and that sort of thing, so you can talk about that. Or maybe you are an actual SharePoint developer, or maybe you are a generic kind of software developer that are looking to move into SharePoint, and you can leverage some of what you talked about in terms of have you built things using JavaScript before that you are looking at implementing through SPFX into SharePoint. Maybe you've done a bit of Power Platform kind of things that you're looking at you could introduce into SharePoint. So there's plenty of different areas of SharePoint. So talk and be specific about the areas that you previously have worked in. If you've not worked in SharePoint before, leverage some of that knowledge about other areas that would come into this role, and also talk about what you would like to get into, why SharePoint, why you're wanting to work into that particular area and that new role that you're trying to get. So the next question, what do you know about our company? Now this is a really important one, and it's any interview ever will always ask this kind of question, and you can kind of weed out people that are not that interested because they've not even bothered to Google and look at your company and what you do and things like that. But specifically around SharePoint, you want to be kind of researching and looking at, well, what are they using SharePoint for? So is this role an in-house role? So you're actually going to be using SharePoint and maintaining existing intranet, or migrating into an existing or building a new intranet, for example, and it's an in-house role? Or is it something that is you're working sort of to their clients, so you're more of a consultancy kind of based thing? So you need to understand what their business does, how they work, and the typical types of projects. So you're not obviously going to know everything, but you can predict the types of things that you can expect. And then tell a story that relates to it. So say, oh, yeah, okay, well, I used to work in a consultancy and we used to do SharePoint projects and blah, blah, blah. And you can relate it to that new role, essentially, and talk about SharePoint projects that you've previously worked on, what worked, didn't work, things like that. And you can get buy-in that you know what you're talking about. And be prepared, because this type of question, the what do you know about our company, could be asked at the very start or the very end. It may come in different shapes and forms, but essentially they want to know, are you actually bothered enough to research us to know what we do, and do you know the challenges of our type of organization? So can you tell me the difference between a communication site and a team site? So this is a technical question. This is the first technical question quite often that I'll ask people to figure out what they know about SharePoint, essentially. And it should be fairly obvious when you work with SharePoint, the difference between a communication site and a team site. But if you are new to using SharePoint, then it's worth me just clarifying what is the difference between these two. So a communication site is for publishing content, and this is what one looks like. Typically, they're used for like an intranet type of landing page where you can offer information to the wider sort of business or organization. They're not necessarily tied to any particular groupings always. They are a standalone kind of SharePoint site for publishing content and building out your kind of intranet. Whereas a team site is specific to a group to actually collaborate and work on them. And this is what a basic team site looks like. As you can see, it's a lot more consolidated. There's not as much kind of functionality on there. It's worth also mentioning, and brownie points that you could talk about, that actually SharePoint team sites also get created when you build a Microsoft team. So a lot of people now use Microsoft Teams as the interface instead of SharePoint, but actually Teams is just the front end of SharePoint when it comes to file management. Every Microsoft team has a SharePoint team site in the background to hold all of the documents, but it can still do lightweight things like news articles, quick links, things like that. So if you did want to have a little bit of a portal, a little bit of a web page almost for your team to have useful links and news and things like that internally, that's what that's for. It's not for sharing with a wide audience. So what are some benefits of using SharePoint Hub sites? So again, this is another question which I use to kind of weed out kind of what people know about modern SharePoint. So it might be that you've worked with old versions of SharePoint which don't have the concept of hub sites. SharePoint Online heavily relies on hub sites. So it's always worth knowing what they do. But essentially a SharePoint Hub site was a bit like that example I was showing you before. where it's almost like the home page of your intranet. So typically hub sites have things like this navigation bar across the top, which can be essentially the consistent point of navigation in the intranet. So as you're moving around, you can use that navigation bar. It will stay exactly the same no matter wherever you go. That navigation bar will stay exactly the same in your intranet. Hub sites are also used for rolling up content, so you can see like news feeds here, which could be potentially pulling out news articles from like department sites like finance or human resources, pulling out those news articles and displaying them. So hub sites will roll up content as well, not just display the information, but it's actually rolling up information from other sites which are associated to that hub site. Other things as well, like branding. So you can see I've got this midnight green color on my hub site. It means that any other sites which are associated to this hub site will automatically inherit that green color. And also you can set things like permissions at a high level. So you can set permissions which then again roll down to those other sites. So let's just take, for example, this is a team site. And again, this would work for Teams or communication sites, but it's not actually linked to a hub site at the moment. But if I click on the cog across the top, click on site information, I can link this to my hub site, and then you'll see instantly it will actually apply the colors. So it's apply that green color, and it's applied that navigation bar across the top to my SharePoint site. So just to reiterate, what are the benefits of using a SharePoint Hub site? Navigation, having a consistent navigation, having a consistent theme, rolling up content like events or news articles or documents, things like that onto a homepage that are associated, and then things like permission, setting a high level permission structure as well. Have you performed a SharePoint migration? So this is not always critical, I should sort of stress, unless it's obviously specified in the job description that you're applying for. You don't necessarily need to be the masters of everything. And as we've already talked about, there's a lot of areas in SharePoint. However, if you have done a SharePoint migration, brilliant, great. It's an extra kind of string to your bow. Now, you can talk about the tools that you've used, so whether it be ShareGate or Metalogix or Microsoft's tools, talk about the tools that you've used to do the migration. Be specific about the tasks for the project. So sometimes when I'm interviewing people, they give very woolly answers about what they were kind of involved with. And you can easily kind of smell when, again, someone's lying or overcommitting to what they've kind of done. But if you're very specific about, okay, was part of the project, I was responsible for creating the SharePoint sites, I was responsible for deploying the migrational tool and setting up the mappings and doing some dummy runs and things like that, you can talk about it and be specific about the tasks that you had. And then also talk about the challenges that you faced and how you resolved them. So was it, for example, that you were finding that there was some complex permission structures inside of SharePoint that you needed to migrate, and that meant that you had to look for third-party tools like ShareGate is really good at doing that type of thing. So you deployed that, you put a trial, you played with it, and blah, blah, blah. You can talk about the challenges you face and specifically how you resolve them. Can you tell me about the best user case for SharePoint, Teams, and OneDrive when it comes to file storage? So you should easily be able to explain the 3 different products and what they're being used for. So for example, SharePoint is the product that you want to use to build out your intranet. It's a single source of truth. It's a platform where you can store policies, procedures, forms, things that everyone can go there and find the latest version of that document. Whereas Microsoft Teams is your daily collaboration. So it's where you're working with your team members or your department on day-to-day files. So let's take, for example, a finance department. They would typically have a communication SharePoint site as part of the overall intranet, where maybe the links from their policies, maybe the latest expense request form is on there, and they've got all that information that they're publishing to the wider organization. But that information typically doesn't change all that often. It's published kind of once and maybe maintained on an annual basis. Whereas their Microsoft Team, which again, remember, has that SharePoint team site in the background, is actually being used on a daily basis. They're sharing spreadsheets with each other and working on things and collaborating on a daily basis. You've then got the OneDrive. So OneDrive is your personal document storage space. So again, you can share documents out of your OneDrive, but it typically is your own personal space. So I would strongly suggest that people understand those 3 different ones, because when it comes to building out intranet or solutionizing, you need to know what each of those products are to be able to best recommend when to use them. What is the difference between a SharePoint site collection admin and a full control user? So again, this is something that kind of weeds people out if they understand SharePoint permissions or not. And if you're not too sure about SharePoint permissions, I do have a separate video which goes through SharePoint permissions and what you need to know. But in short, a site collection admin can never be locked out of something. So a full control user can create things, delete things, build things, add people, and so can a site collection admin. The only difference is that full control user could be locked out of a site, a document library, a file, or a folder, whereas a site collection admin will always have access to everything. Because a site collection admin essentially is typically like your IT admin who is actually going in and resolving issues and things like that on a day-to-day basis if someone gets locked out or someone leaves the business and there's a restricted folder that needs to be shared with somebody, as an example. Can SharePoint be accessed externally? So again, this is a common question that I ask to try and find out people's experiences, and it might be a bit more of an advanced thing, this, because not everybody's worked with external sharing SharePoint sites, but the answer is yes. And it's essentially what we know as an extranet. So it's maybe you're built a supplier portal or a customer portal or an employee onboarding portal or something like that, where you're wanting to give access to people who don't have licenses for your Microsoft 365, for example. So describe steps for enabling it. So actually, I've got a video specifically about how you can enable SharePoint for external access. So watch that and you'll get all the steps that you need for that, so you can come across really aware and engage on how this actually works. I'd also suggest that you give recommendations for splitting out intranets from extranets. It's never a good idea really to have all of your sort of internal intranet documents available externally in the same place. If you're going to have a supplier area and an internal area, have them as two separate SharePoint sites. Can SharePoint be used as a database? So again, this is a slight trick question because it's a kind of yes and no. No, SharePoint is not a relationship database. It's not like SQL, it's not like Dataverse, it's not like any of those things. However, it can store data for Canvas Power Apps. So you might have a SharePoint list which has got some information, and you can surface that through a Canvas app or store things in there. And it is often used by people because it's free. It's part of the licenses you've already got, so you don't necessarily need to purchase anything more like you would need to for SQL, for example, as a premium connector, or extra points if you can talk a bit about Dataverse and your understanding of Dataverse, and talk a little bit about that. But realistically, if you were after a database, it would be Dataverse rather than being SharePoint. But it's a bit of a trick question that you can store data in SharePoint that can be leveraged by Canvas apps. What challenges have you faced working with SharePoint? So if you've worked with SharePoint for a number of years, you will have encountered issues. It's just a matter of fact. So talk about them. Talk about things like permissions, where permission structures might have got a bit too complicated and it's ended up meaning that some people can see some files or some sites that other people can't, and it becomes a bit of an administration nightmare. Talk about runaway structures. So a very common problem that we saw in the SharePoint kind of community was during the COVID kind of lockdown periods, a lot of people got using Microsoft 365, Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, but they ended up with runaway structures because they were trying to do it all themselves because they had to do it so quickly, that they ended up these runaway structures of loads of different SharePoint sites, loads of different teams, and it was a bit of a mess. So talk a little bit about that. Maybe ownership of sites. So when people leave organization, actually who owns the SharePoint content? What do you do with it? If you need to tidy it up, that sort of stuff. Talk about those types of challenges. But again, come back to always talk about what you specifically did. Don't talk about challenges that the organization, the business, the company that you worked for faced. Talk about the challenges that you specifically faced and what you did to resolve them. And then finally, when you're kind of closing out, often you'll be kind of asked by the interviewer, do you have any questions for us? And now, you should always have a couple of questions lined up. Ideally, if they can be specific to that particular job, even better. So what is a typical SharePoint project for you? So if it's an enterprise company, they'll start talking about maybe setting up kind of department sites and things like that, and or initiatives and that sort of things that they're building in SharePoint. If it's a consultancy kind of company, they'll be talking about projects that they have with their clients, and maybe their intranet projects, maybe their custom solution projects. They could be all sorts of different things. So again, ask them about that to understand. Another common question is, do you need to know any code languages? So especially if the job is advertised as a SharePoint developer, you probably want to know, well, what languages are you going to need to know for this? Typically, they're going to be things like JavaScript, SPFX, things like that. But depending on if it's an older version of SharePoint, there might be all sorts of different types of developments, plugins, things like that, that you might need to support as part of the role. So it's always worth asking that question to understand. And then when it comes to finalizing the kind of interview, the very last thing I always suggest you to do, and this is not SharePoint related, this is just a generic interview top tip from me, is ask the interviewer, what is your favorite memory of working here? And what that'll do is it'll subconsciously drum them up an idea of what their perfect day was and things like that, and it will leave the meeting in a really good position. You'll more than likely get the interviewer to laugh when you ask them that question, and again, that will kind of boost the feelings in the room, and you will become a lot more memorable because it's the last thing that you've said to them. They felt good about it. They thought, oh, that was a slightly curveball question, wasn't expecting that, and they'll more likely remember you afterwards. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel for future SharePoint top tips. I'd really like to hear from you in the comments about any interview questions that you've been asked in a SharePoint interview before, and what your answers were, or anything that you might have got stuck on in an interview that you've learned from, and maybe you could share it with other people so they can learn from that experience as well, and make it even easier for them to get their next SharePoint role. But thank you very much for watching, and keep an eye out for future SharePoint videos.